Welcome to episode 74 of the GT on 5G. It's the latest inside scoop on everything 5G. We cover 6 topics in about 15 minutes, and it's brought to you by More Insights and Strategy. I'm Will Townsend, and joining me again this week is fellow analyst Anshel Sag. Let's get started with my first topic. I want to talk about T-Mobile. So T-Mobile announced its 3Q earnings this week, and I dug into that release. I don't really want to talk about the financials, but I do want to talk about its fixed wireless access business. So this was launched several months ago, and what Mike Sievert, the CEO, reported was that T-Mobile is on track to serve almost 500,000 subscribers by the end of the year, and they expect by 2025 to serve 7 to 8 million. Not surprising to me with respect to the profile of customer. It's primarily rural, and also folks that are frustrated with their broadband cable service. So, and I've spoken to fixed wireless access and it's the opportunity for it to be an element in helping to bridge the digital divide. Now, the big question is, how is T-Mobile doing overall in building out its enterprise services portfolio? I've spoken to this in the past. Everyone knows, I believe on the planet that, T-Mobile was historically, very consumer focused, very disruptive there. With Sprint, that brings some business acumen. I've spoken to that as well. But I think fixed wireless access, from my perspective, is their crawl before their walk and run. And I do expect that they will lean into, the resources that Sprint has brought with the acquisition. I'd like to see it happen a little bit sooner. Sprint had invested quite heavily in its Curiosity IoT sort of solution in a box. And I'd like to see some movement there, and also solutions that will scale up from the mid market into the larger enterprise space to compete with the likes of AT&T and Verizon. So from my perspective, this is a great start. I believe the goodness with FWA again is helping to bridge that rural digital divide. But I'd like to see more. But would love to get your perspective.
Yeah, so as you can see, I was playing around. This is actually their 5G fixed wireless gateway. Mm-hmm. I've been messing with it here in San Diego, but the issue is that it's. I think that the network itself is not quite where it needs to be yet for fixed wireless to necessarily be all things to everybody. Mm-hmm. I think that it does have potential to solve people's problems. I've seen people tweet about how they kicked Spectrum to the curb, and they live in a place where they can get 300 to 400 megabits per second on T-Mobile's mid-band network. Mm-hmm. So I think there's definitely some improvements there, and I think there are also people who could benefit from just the low band alone, because there are people who live in places where they still have ADSL. Mm-hmm. And that's the best that they can get. And that's, capping out for them at 10 to 20 megabits. So I still think there's a lot of opportunities, but I think to some people's points, there needs to be better equipment out there right now. Only there's only one Nokia device, which is what I had in hand over there. Right. And there was a new announcement that just came out that Netgear now has a mesh 5G device with an external antenna plug-in, which I think is a big deal, because I think that's a big opportunity for people to have better signal and to really have a true fixed wireless deployment. I think these devices are a way for people to get relief quickly and for T-Mobile to deploy quickly, because they're very easy to deploy. But I think long term, you're going to want people to have slightly more robust antennas and more fixed wireless solutions.
Yeah, I would agree with that. A couple of additional points before we move to your first topic. Mike Sievert spoke to the fact that the claim was that T-Mobile actually grew its FWA footprint at a greater percentage than Verizon. Verizon's been at it a heck of a lot longer. So I found that was quite interesting. And the other point that he made was that with the scale up, and 500,000 subscribers given the launch, that's a pretty awesome achievement from my perspective. But at the same time, he said that the network capacity is keeping up with the growth with their FWA business. But to your point, I agree. There aren't a lot of solutions out there. You mentioned Nokia. That's the private label that T-Mobile's deploying right now. But that should grow and change over time. But I think it's a great start for T-Mobile. I would like to see some more, growth and maturity in their enterprise portfolio. That should come in time. Again, you've got to crawl before you walk and run. But let's move to your first topic this week, and this is quite alarming. You and I both caught this earlier in the week, but there was a warning issued by the FCC around C-band and its potential interference with the safety of aviation. And there were some additional announcements this week from carriers. So I'll let you take it away.
So the clarification is the FAA made this notice, which is interesting because it kind of conflicts with what the FCC is doing on spectrum availability. So the notice came out 2 days ago, and it was basically saying that there are issues with interference for the aviation industry pertaining to the deployment of C-band, mid-band spectrum in the 3.7 to 4 gigahertz band. Now, the issue is that Verizon and AT&T are both slated to start rolling out their C-band spectrum December 5th. And the issue with that is they can't roll out this spectrum now that the FAA has come out with this statement. And they're starting to discuss now how they can mitigate this issue. But the fascinating discussion around this is both AT&T and Verizon's mid-band spectrum that they acquired to the tune of around $70 billion or $80 billion actually is in the lowest part of that C-band chunk of spectrum. So it's even less likely to interfere with the avionics equipment that planes are using for ground radar. So it's a very fascinating discussion. I tried reading the report that the FAA based their findings on and the reason why they made this statement. It's a report from 2020, which means it's over a year old, and that this wasn't addressed a year ago when it could have been, which means that either the FAA or the FCC are dragging their feet in solving this problem. And the other issue is this spectrum is really crucial to Verizon and AT&T's 5G strategy long term.
Absolutely.
And currently, the Wall Street Journal is reporting that AT&T and Verizon have both delayed their spectrum rollout until January of next year from December of this year, which is only really a month delay. And I think that's probably to give everybody a chance to realize what's going on and whether or not there are real concerns right now. But also to potentially give themselves more time to figure out their own thing. But I have a strong feeling that all the carriers are fairly aware of what the situation is. And, we've seen the 5G Americas group come out with a paper not a few months ago, kind of addressing this issue as well. But I will say that it's spectrum interference is a very complicated issue. And it seems like from the 220-page document that I skimmed through, I tried to read it, but it's 220 pages, a lot to read. It seems like there are some valid points in terms of interference, but some of those points, the interference is below thresholds, and in some cases it's above. But I think ultimately it's, having the spectrum in field, doing some real testing, which honestly should have been done well before the auction even occurred.
Right.
So, there's a lot of, I feel like there's some governmental issues here, and it might be that there isn't actually any validity to any of this, because I don't think we've ever actually seen a single carrier come out and say, forget it, we can't see what our altitude is because of this interference. So I think there's going to be a lot more learning that has to happen. Money needs to be spent on testing, but it needs to get done fast because there's tens of billions of dollars worth of assets at stake. And honestly, the the readiness of our 5G infrastructure as a country and the economy is at stake, in my opinion.
Yeah, I agree. And boy, if I was Verizon reading that, that report, I would have been freaking out, right? Because I mean, they're the ones that spent the most, within the C-band auction. And this sounds to me like a lack of coordination between government agencies, which, isn't surprising. They tend to be quite siloed, so not to get political there, but it is what it is. And this is very late breaking news. It kind of caught you and I off guard earlier this week, and I'm sure we're going to see a lot of developments come out of this, and it'll be interesting, to report back on possibly a future podcast. But let's move to my second topic this week. And I'm going to give some credit to Enterprise IoT Insights and Sean Kinney, editor-in-chief with RCR Wireless. That is a sister site of RCR. And there was an article written about Verizon's sort of view on the IoT opportunity. And the article was pennies to millions. And, we do have Bill Curtis in our firm that's an IoT expert, so I'm not going to go too deep there because that's really his purview. But really where I want to focus sort of my insights on are around the monetization claim there. And as I read through that article and, read through what this Verizon executive was stating, and I don't recall that person's name, so I apologize for that. But it really, to me, the conclusion that I kind of gained from that article was, Verizon feels like, from a cost perspective and an operational life perspective of these sensors, the technology has gotten to a certain point where it can support monetization. And that really reminded me of the whole, sort of dumb pipe attitude that, honestly, all of the carriers, I think, on a global basis, really, we're focused on within an LTE world. And, the over-the-top application providers were able to sort of ride that investment in $1 billion of infrastructure and really monetize that. Now, I don't believe that's going to happen in a 5G world. The operators, they realize that, we're seeing all of them globally incubating proof of concept labs, funding startups, and are really, trying to find that next really, really compelling use case. But, I was sort of left with, show me the money, because it's not just about, operational life and cost. It's about building an ecosystem. But would love to get your insights here, buddy.
Yeah, I mean, I think that Verizon as a whole is pivoting towards business harder. They already are a very business heavy company, even though if you look at their revenues, consumer is still bigger for them considerably. I think Verizon is pivoting towards business applications, and that's why I think they're talking more about IoT as a big opportunity.
Sure.
I just think that they want to start offering more services and features that are business focused, and that's all IoT, right?
Sure.
IoT for consumer, it's very thin margin, but when you have massive scale on a business enterprise application for IoT, then it's an entirely different game. And I think they realize that there's tons of opportunities to place sensors within an enterprise to improve that enterprise's intelligence, profitability, and readiness,
Sure.
for a multitude of things. So I think it's a long discussion, but I think Verizon sees it as an opportunity to grow their business, specifically on the business side.
Yeah, no, certainly. And, IoT is going to play a big role in, factory automation with 5G private networks and that sort of thing. I mean, the predictive capabilities of determining if a machine is, out of sync and, getting, to, replacing a part before it actually fails. And that's going to keep, production lines up and, production very, very smooth. So, absolutely. It's a huge opportunity. I guess for me, it was like, where's the beef? I didn't see a lot of the detail behind the monetization, but it'll be interesting to kind of keep tabs on that and see how they develop that program overall. But let's move to your second topic this week. And it's no surprise that T-Mobile has been the first to 5G standalone. And you want to talk about something related to that.
Yeah, so this is kind of a development along that path, but it's actually, I would say, more an evolution of both its ability to do carrier aggregation as well as its ability to do standalone. So T-Mobile announced that they were able to achieve uh, download speeds of almost 5 gigabits per second, 4.950 gigabits, which means that I believe that's the fastest we've seen to date on a commercial network. And this is a combination of their 2.5 gigahertz band 41 and their millimeter wave band N260. And what's interesting about that is it's a combination of mid band and high band. We've seen a lot of low band and mid band and low band and high band. We haven't seen much mid band and high band, which is interesting because those are both very rich in spectrum and in throughput and in capacity. So having those two combined shows how powerful T-Mobile's network truly can be in places where they deploy both millimeter wave and mid band. And this bodes well for companies like Verizon as well, because Verizon has a very big millimeter wave footprint, and they're spending considerable amounts of money on C-band to ensure that they have a good good mid-band deployment as well in terms of coverage. So, this bodes well for T-Mobile as well as Verizon and possibly even AT&T users. But it's funny because T-Mobile made this announcement and they kind of gave us an idea of how fast this can really be. But it's funny because in my mind, I think this is almost more interesting for Verizon just because of how much millimeter wave they've gotten already deployed and plan to deploy.
Yeah, absolutely. When you look at sort of T-Mobile's priority, it's been low band, right? Because they want to provide ubiquitous coverage, and then followed by mid band. They have some millimeter wave assets, but when you look at AT&T and Verizon on the other hand, certainly Verizon, their priority has been building out their millimeter wave, right? Their ultra wideband service. So this is interesting, and certainly the blend of both mid band and high band, it should be able to unlock a lot of really compelling use cases that take advantage of the low latency, the propagation, and the throughput. So it's very interesting. But let's move to my third and final topic this week. And the space race continues to heat up. So the FCC approved Boeing's ability to launch low Earth orbit satellites to deliver broadband communication services. And so we've talked about, multiple, companies that have been doing this. The division of SpaceX that's been doing this. When you look at what the traditional satellite providers like in Hughes and their investment in OneWeb and that sort of thing. So, my question is it too much? I don't know. From my perspective, competition breeds innovation. It should also breed cost competitiveness. But I found it interesting that, Boeing's been at this since 2017. So and they were requesting waivers and that sort of thing. So I don't know, what changed, if maybe this infrastructure bill that's trying to get through Congress had anything to do with that. But I believe one of the positive aspects is that there's been clearly identified issues around the need to bridge the digital divide, and satellite can be a part of that. But would love to get your insights there as well.
Yeah, I think the issue with satellite being used to fill the gap in rural areas is none of the satellite providers have shown that they can actually provide coverage to millions of users. And there are millions of users who are disadvantaged in rural areas. So, if they can all serve a couple 100,000, that doesn't really solve the issue. Because ultimately the density of their network and the throughput of their satellite constellation is what can determine how many users they can serve simultaneously. So the issue is density and cost. But I remain optimistic, but also cautious because I know that space is technically unlimited, but not space around Earth.
Right.
So there's going to be limitations and physical ones, and I am worried about what that might mean in the future. But I also hope that the competition, feeds more innovation and rapid improvements in terms of how many users can be served by this. And to your point, satellite can be used to improve 5G coverage for users, and just delivering internet service to people in places where they don't have any choices. I have a friend who doesn't have any choice other than cellular, and just got kicked off of his cellular provider because he was using too much data, and he's like, I don't have any other choice.
Right. Yeah, it's a challenge. And, talk about contention. We were talking about, the FAA earlier and FCC and, what's going on with C-band, with this low orbit, satellite network, we're talking, hundreds of satellites per company. And so I'm a little more concerned about those satellites, all the satellites floating around than anything else, but it'll be interesting to see. But let's move to your third and final topic this week. You want to talk about Qualcomm, and they had another blockbuster earnings announcement, correct?
Yeah, so Qualcomm announced earnings yesterday, um, and basically they were better than everybody expected. They said that their chip business alone generated $7.7 billion in revenue, up 56% year on year. And their stock went up like 13%. But the big deal was the fact that the company says that it expects the chip shortage to be in the rear view by the end of the year.
Wow.
That Qualcomm had put in place supply earlier in this year to ensure that it would have enough capacity if demand were to continue to grow. And as a result, Cristiano Amon, the CEO, said supply worked exactly as they had planned, and that scale helps, and that they addressed the issue early by putting capacity plans in place, and it's working exactly as they had planned. And he said that the reality is, if we look where we are today, we have a great Q4, but we're still short, meaning that supply is still trying to catch up with demand, but they're going to see supply substantially improve at the end of the calendar year, as well as when they get into 2022.
Mhm.
But there is still more demand than supply. So, the company basically bet on 5G and smartphones, which is its primary business, and it's seeing those bets pay off. It's also diversified into RF, and automotive. And yeah, if you just look at what they were able to accomplish, a lot of this really comes down to the fact that Qualcomm, for the longest time, has had a multi-fab model. So whenever somebody goes out and asks Qualcomm, so this is a 5 nanometer chip, which fab are you using? They rarely actually answered that question because it's usually a multi-fab solution. So from my recollection, they have agreements in place today with Global Foundries, TSMC, and Samsung, and they signed a deal with Intel earlier this year to also expand their supply capabilities. And I think if you look at what they've accomplished this quarter and what they probably are going to do for the next few quarters, they're going to be able to maintain whatever supply their customers ask for, and they might even gain some customers that might have to come to them because they don't have a choice. We saw this happen with Intel when they had some supply issues. AMD picked up customers purely because they had supply and Intel didn't. So it's not like Qualcomm is necessarily a small player in the space, but it is very interesting to see that they are very confident in their ability to supply. And they're probably it sounds like they're probably going to be the first ones to really come out of this chip shortage ahead in terms of being able to take advantage of their early planning and anticipating the chip shortage before it got really bad.
Yeah, it's amazing continuity of supply and managing that correctly can either make or break you. You mentioned Intel with some initial, I think they had some fab, issues, bringing up whatever that nanometer process was. As a product marketer at Dell many years ago, launching products, if we didn't get our procurement house straight, we could face the same thing as well. So certainly it's one thing to be a technology powerhouse and have the IP and have the marketing strength of a Qualcomm, but they have a commensurate procurement organization that has ensured that continuity of supply. And it sounds like they were planning for this well before there were any sort of indications that we were going to experience what we've been experiencing. So kudos to them. But hey, buddy, another great podcast. Why don't you take us home?
Absolutely. We hope our viewers and listeners found this week's topics interesting. If anyone out there would like to provide us insight on a specific 5G topic for a future podcast, please reach out to us on social media. Will is at WillTownTech, and I'm at Anshel. We hope you have a great weekend, and please tune in again next week.